But what I found was there really wasn't any sort of system out there, especially when you reach scale. But one of the first questions I always have with executives is how should we evaluate your performance?
Welcome to the SaaS Builder Podcast. I'm your host, Randy Wooten, and today we're going to discuss the Chief Executive Operating System, or CEOS. Joining me is Joel Trammell, the chairman and founder of the Chief Executive Operating System Company, which is a management system designed for companies with over 50 employees to develop better strategies, increase clarity, and deliver predictable performance. Joel is also a longtime operator. He was the founder and chairman of Chorus Software and former CEO of Black Box Network Services. He combines practical experience with thought leadership, authoring influential books like The CEO Tightrope, The Manager's Playbook, and The Chief Executive Operating System. And we're going to start today's conversation by answering the question, how do I build my own operating system as CEO? Joel, welcome to the SaaS Builder Podcast.
Great to be with you, Randy.
Yes, and for the audience, this is a great pleasure for me, Joel, because I've read your books. I've read one book in its entirety, The Chief Executive Operating System, and I have the other one, The CEO Tightrope, on my bedstand. I'm going to get to it. And I also have appreciated the conversations we've had where you've provided some coaching. And then number two, we brought you in for my executive team to help talk about the Chief Executive Operating System, which is actually an operating system for an entire company. And I thought it was such a powerful idea. We brought you in and we've had a great conversation. And so I really am excited to have you here. As I tell everybody, that first book, The Chief Executive Operating System, I wish someone had given it to me in 2015 when I started my job at Rocket Fuel. I felt like a total imposter stepping into the job and had no idea. So maybe back up, do the way back camera and tell us, like, before you wrote this book, what was the reality that you were seeing for CEOs that you were helping to coach, having been a long experienced CEO yourself and building a course? Like, what was the lay of the land at the time?
Yeah, I started with building a course for CEOs. I was chairman of what they call the Austin Technology Council, and we thought we needed to train new CEOs, and that would be a valuable experience. And so you start doing research, and you expect that maybe Stanford would have a system for being CEO, Harvard would have a system. You would come in as the practical person and tell them, hey, guys, you don't understand it, you're too academic. But what I found was there really wasn't any sort of system out there, especially when you reach scale. When the company went from 50 to 100 to more employees, there really wasn't a lot of thought around what the CEO does or how to approach the role. And so that's what I really wanted to address was how do you think about it? And when I started out, because I had to learn this stuff over 25, 30 years of running companies, piece together best practices in each of the different areas to try to create something that was holistic and a system approach to how to do the CEO job.
Yeah, well, I can really appreciate that. I've started my own book online called The 8 Secrets to Success for SaaS CEOs. And when I read your book, I was like, oh, darn, Joel's already laid it all out. You and Peter Drucker with The Effective Executive. I was like, oh, man, I should have read the book before I started writing. But great. So I do think there's this idea that when you become a CEO, it's very hard to find the resources. And investors may say, hey, here's a mentor or here's a coach, but there's no playbook. And so can you talk a little bit about the Chief Executive Operating System, what it is, and how can CEOs leverage it to turn their companies into world-class, performance-oriented organizations?
Yeah, so a lot of people get into the job by being an expert at some functional area of the business, right? They're a great salesperson, or a great marketing person, or a great finance person. And the way you do those jobs is you're the expert. You're the key person in the room. You collect all the data. You make the decisions based upon your expertise. But if I take that person and put them in the CEO role, it's really a change in the nature of the job. You're now a generalist. You're not a specialist anymore. And so how you make that transition, and your board expects results, right? They expect results in a year or 2 years. That's about how long. It's kind of like being a head football coach. What have you done for me lately? And so thinking about it from a systematic way is, I think, really important.
Yeah, we talk a lot about that T-shaped careers and having depth of expertise in a specific function. And then I think you kind of, if you're going to be a CEO or have a path to be a CEO at a larger company, you probably need some experience in several functions. You just can't run up in one function, only be a finance guy. And so I do think at each of those career transitions is how do you add more scope and get out of your comfort zone, which is your strong suit. And then once you become that generalist, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think that's a really great point. I think when I first took over at Rocket Fuel, which is a public company, the executives that were on the team were older than me and more seasoned and very seasoned in their specific function. And I think that was part of the biggest challenge was how do you go from a place of where you have the answers in your specific function to where you need to really lead with questions and try to help foster powerful conversations around options versus making decisions because of your own expertise.
Yeah, you're now managing experts and even selecting experts instead of being the expert in the room. And that's what most CEOs don't have any experience at. How do you figure out if somebody's an expert in an area that you know very little about?
Well, let's go there for a little bit. What would you suggest for CEOs to do that? I mean, I know that especially because I'm not an engineer. I tell people I'm technical. I used to be a product manager. I could write business requirements, but I can't call BS when the engineer shows up and says it's going to take 2 months of development, not 1 month. How do you ask the questions when you're evaluating an executive to determine whether they've got that expertise that you need to round you out?
Well, one of the first questions I always have with executives is how should we evaluate your performance? How
Hmm.
would we measure what you are doing? Let's come up with three metrics that if those are going better, that means you're doing a good job. If they're not, and often listening to what they propose as metrics is very enlightening of how they see the role. And you probably have some ideas as CEO what they should be choosing. And that's where I start every conversation with an executive.
That's great insight. So let's go to the other end of the spectrum. A lot of the folks in our audience are people who are early stage founders. So they start as a founder and then they will evolve as the company grows into more of a CEO role when they start to hire people, functional experts to report to them. But at the beginning, it's just them in the garage with an idea. I'm talking mostly to technical founders. So help us understand that distinction that you make between the project manager CEO and the enterprise leading CEO. We are talking a little bit about some of those characteristics, but what are the similarities and differences for those early stage professionals that have never been a CEO before, but they are a founder?
Yeah, when you start out with 1 to, say, 20 employees, not only are you the CEO, but you're also typically performing all the executive functions. You can have your executive team meeting when you shave in the morning. And so there's not a lot of communication involved. You're keeping track. You know everybody. You know their strengths and weaknesses. You know what people are working on. And all of the data is flowing up to you, and you're making all the decisions. And then sometime as you transition from about 20 employees to 50 or 100 employees, at some point it exceeds the mental capacity of any person I've ever met to keep track of what everybody's doing, to be able to process all the data you're seeing coming up in the organization. And so you have to flip it. And now, instead of all the data flowing up and you making the decisions, what needs to happen is you need to pass the decision criteria down to the people at the appropriate level to make the same decision you would make if you were there looking over their shoulder. And so that goes from what I call project management CEO to enterprise management CEO.
Super interesting. I'd spent some time in the military, and I think this break point that you're talking about, 20 people is the size of a platoon. And
Right.
then that 100 people is kind of the size of a company. And it
Right.
does, even in the military, you have these different transition points of where you have to operate differently as a platoon leader versus a company leader versus a regimental leader. Do you think there's another inflection point at 1,000 people or 5,000 people where you're still an enterprise CEO, but now you're doing like, I don't know, portfolio management. And it's just a very different skill than that growth phase, I think, between about 10 million and call it 100 million. What's your sense? Is there a third inflection point?
I think the next inflection point is really about markets and customers. When you start changing markets and who the customer is, that presents another level of complexity. I don't know about you, but I didn't find the public company versus private company transition that difficult. Yeah, I had to read something once a quarter that the lawyers wrote, but as a small public company, most people aren't paying attention to you. They're not hanging on every word. And so I didn't feel like that was a big thing. But when you change markets, when you have a different customer, there's a lot of work the CEO has to do there to manage multiple organizations like that.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, that there is a level of complexity in terms of your go to market. So, to your point, you're adding additional products. You move from one product to maybe a platform with modules. You're moving segments from so small to medium to enterprise. That break between mid market and enterprise is so different in terms of how you set up a go to market. And then maybe regions, moving from US only into other regions, and EMEA is radically different than APAC. And so it
Sure.
does feel like there's probably a different way of operating in that kind of business unit field alignment or something. But I think for the core of our audience is this inflection point of you're the founder, project manager, you're able to manage everything and know everything versus creating a container. But speaking of that, one of the things your system really helps is trying to create predictable performance in their business operations. What are some of the strategies you would recommend for a SaaS founder to develop clarity around how to produce predictable performance, other than ask your executive, what do you think you should measure? What are the other
Yeah.
kind of key strategies you would execute?
Yeah, and I always tell the story. I remember sitting in a, standard weekly staff meeting for the 100th time or whatever, and it always seemed that we spent all our time talking about the sales forecast. And I had this kind of aha moment. Why is sales the only group that by process is giving me information about the future? And I said, why can't I get information about the future from every group? Instead of getting data, which is by definition something that's already happened, it's historical, why don't I set clear goals for everyone and then ask them, how likely are we to get there? Just like we do for sales, we set a quota number, we set a revenue number, and then we ask, hey, how are we doing on the forecast? And so that was really an aha moment for me towards building predictability, was changing the way those meetings were set up. Instead of being data dumps to me, is to be prediction information from every department.
I think that was probably the key thing in our conversation with my executive team that you brought, as we had many insights, but the thing I took away was this idea of the use the data in the scorecard, understanding what the trend is, and then using that to predict, are you going to actually hit the target for the month or the quarter? So everybody has MBRs, everyone has QBRs. I think often they're about historical reflection versus the no, 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 we have these targets for this quarter. Are we going to hit it? The other thing which you said was the second question, which I thought was really powerful, was what's the quality of the work or something along those lines
Right.
that has been done to date to make sure that we are going to hit this forecast. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I think that question is another really compelling one, especially when you're talking with people like engineers or product folks.
There's kind of a yin and a yang, right? You define some goal, and again, it could be in any of the functional areas. We want to achieve this goal. And we ask the question, how likely are you to achieve the goal? Great. But then, is there anything else going on around that goal that's relevant? And so we try to gather that information by asking the question, how do you feel about the quality of the work done so far? And just because somebody says they don't feel good about it doesn't mean that they're not personally doing good work. I mean, it could be a sales guy saying, hey, I'm going to hit the number, but I've drained my pipeline and I've got nothing for next quarter, or it's low margin business. Or it could be a software developer saying, hey, we're going to ship the product on time, but it's held together with duct tape and baling wire and support better be ready. And so it's anything that impacts that goal, but not directly related to the likelihood.
Yeah, I love that as well in terms of just providing the opportunity to have real conversations and be self-reflective in terms of and look, it doesn't do you good to overestimate the quality or underestimate the quality. So I do think there's also in that process you start to calibrate and build capabilities around predicting accurately. So how many sprint
Absolutely.
points is this going to take? Right. And when we say it's a large t-shirt size and you get through the activity of both predicting it getting done, but also the quality of the delivery of the code, those two components I think are really valuable. So that's a great recommendation. You were talking a little earlier about one of the big transitions from project based CEO to enterprise CEO is moving from making all the decisions to setting up a decision framework or decision structure. Can you talk a little bit about recommendations for SaaS leaders to enhance their strategic decision making process or system? Like, how do we know we're focused on the big rocks?
There's a lot involved in that, a lot of communication that has to occur. It starts for me, with mission and vision. What's the purpose of the organization? What are your differentiated values? What do you believe about the world that other people don't? How are you going to compete? And then a set of strategic objectives. I usually look out for a existing company about 3 years and say, hey, 3 years from now, how are we going to provide value to customers? If we had all our customers gathered in the room, what would they say is the greatest value we could reasonably provide to them? And then if we had all our shareholders in the room, what would they say is the greatest value we can provide to them, and so on and so forth. And so communicating all that information down to everyone in the organization so that they have the proper understanding to know where we're going and align their decisions with where the organization is going. And again, the real test to me is, are the people at the bottom of the organization typically making the same decision you would have made if you were sitting there standing over their shoulder with all the information they had? And when you're a CEO and you see a lot of decisions being made that you don't agree with, or you're asking yourself why people are doing that, it's a clear sign that you haven't communicated the necessary decision making information down to the organization.
I think it's a great insight in terms of it's not their fault, it's your fault.
That's right.
Right? If you haven't set up the structure and the systems and the clarity and reinforced what the priorities are and how to make trade-offs, then when people are making the decision, now granted, some people make a mistake. That's okay. You provide some coaching, right? And if they've never done it before, you got to provide some coaching and mentorship. But when you have someone who's operating as a seasoned frontline support person or customer success person or salesperson, and they're not doing the right set of things and to close the deal or drive customer success, then I think it's a really interesting perspective to reflect on you, not them. What
That's
could
right.
you do better
That's
to make them more successful? Under that idea of the system, I do think we were chatting a little bit about when I came up through Salesforce, Mark Benioff's V2 Mom, the one pager where you have your visions, your values, your methods, your obstacles, your metrics, and the time he would spend when I was part of that company. I was one of the 600 managers that would get together. I was a low level guy, but I was still in this group. And we would spend 8 hours going through the V2 Mom and
right.
ranking the priorities, and everyone had to agree to it. And then you had to build your own V2 Mom. And it's like V2 Moms all the way down, cascading to create the alignment. In your book and in your system, you have something similar. It's kind of the one-page document. Can you talk a little bit about it? Because I think that also is critical as an artifact for the company and as but please go ahead. I'll follow up.
Well, it's funny. It came about for me visiting with a CEO one time, and I was there early for the meeting. And of course, I'm kind of impatient, so I just walked up to the first person I saw in the office sitting at a desk and said, "What's the plan here?" And they looked at me like I had three heads and said, basically, I just pay payroll, or I just do this here. And so then I walked into the CEO, and he had been CEO about a year. And I said, I have one question for you. I said, have you done anything in the last year that has changed the behavior of the individual contributors in your organization? And this was a 1,000-person, newly public company. And he just couldn't come up with anything. And I thought that was so interesting, right? Because you spend all your time in the CEO role. You're having all these big, high, important meetings. You think you're making all these decisions. You think you're not doing anything. But if the people that are servicing the customer, building the product, selling the product, if you haven't changed their behavior, what have you really done? And so, what do you need to change their behavior? Well, you got to tell them where you're going. You got to be crystal clear on what the expectations are for each of the functional areas of the business. Where do we want to be in 3 years down the road with clear, definable, not some generic, we want to grow. We want to grow 40% such that revenue's 27 million in 3 years. Okay, that's definable, right? And then not only financial metrics, but metrics for each of the functional areas of the business. Where do we want to be in sales? Where do we want to be in marketing? Where do we want to be in the product side? And then most importantly, what I think a lot of CEOs miss is they get so focused on shareholders, their private equity owners, their themselves, even if they're the owner of the company, that they forget to build a sustainable company. You got to consistently provide value not only to shareholders, but also to customers and employees. And what's your strategic plan to provide value to customers for the next 3 years? What's your strategic plan to provide value to employees over the next 3 years? In most companies, customers and employees are handled very tactically. They wait till there's a catastrophe, a customer calls us up mad or quits, or an employee gets mad and quits that didn't want to lose. and suddenly we run a fire drill, right? Well, that's a sure sign you're handling those two constituencies tactically and not strategically.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think that tension along that you have it represented as a triangle between
Right.
customers, shareholders, and employees is you sit in the center of that as the CEO, and you help decide where does energy get deployed and where do resources get deployed and what do you talk about and what do you reinforce, what behaviors are you reinforcing and what's acceptable. And I do think that idea of, I think for early stage founders it's hard to think about, gosh, next week, let alone 3 years. But I do think on a regular basis, maybe once a year, get with the board and talk about what are we trying to achieve here, because they will have in their head a target
Right.
outcome, a certain amount of money, which means there's a shape of the business, which means you got to be able to grow X, Y, and Z. And you just can't say we're going to grow 20% per year. You got to
Right.
have that next level of depth. And it takes you a couple of cycles to learn how to do that. But getting strategic alignment and then translating that for your employees so they understand what you're doing and then help show the future. Obviously, you're not sharing your revenue data, but show the future what you're trying to achieve with your customers is probably some of the best practical next steps that people can take to start building their own executive operating system outside of reading your book, which I would recommend to everybody. Great.
One point on that I'll make is I just don't see when it comes to the customers and employees that with strategic planning. And it surprises me because I see a lot of companies that want to say customer first and we're just going to focus on the customer and everything will take care of itself, or some say employee first, or some say shareholder first. And if you don't understand that those three are all in tension and it's a multi-dimensional optimization problem. And that's another reason it's fundamentally different than the executive roles. Because if you're the VP of sales, it's single dimension optimization. More revenue is good, less revenue is bad. Okay.
Right.
That doesn't make the job easy, but it's single dimensional. And when you get in the CEO role, the real challenge is you've got these three entities and you got to balance across. And that's why it's a challenge.
Absolutely.